What can we learn about the worship practices of the first Lutherans from a Reformation edict by a Calvinist leader? Find out in Will Whedon's column in the latest Issues Etc. journal. We'll send it to you for free. Just click the red journal subscription button at issuesetc.org and enter your email address. In the Wittenberg Trail feature, Pastor Michael Hughes writes about his journey from progressive Lutheranism to confessional Lutheranism. The Issues Etc. journal. Subscribe for free at issuesetc.org.
I think the fate of Christianity in Europe should be very, very sobering for Christians in America and make them realize that nothing can be taken for granted at this point.
What you actually can affirm for your child is you are baptized. You don't need to be defined by this gender dysphoria that's nagging at you and trying to get you to carve up your body and make all these changes. You are actually defined by what God says.
Union with the flesh of Jesus. There is nothing greater than that. And American evangelicalism cannot say that. It's a disembodied Christ. There's no Jesus in the water, Jesus in the Word, Jesus in your ear, Jesus in your mouth.
All of the Lutherans from the very beginning to the very end teach not only that good works are to be done, but even the necessity of good works.
Grocery clerks in Tennessee love listening to Issues Etc.
Sometimes a archaeological discovery comes along that catches everyone's attention. This one has. It's being reported in some of the headlines that wooden beams from Solomon's temple have been discovered, damaged by fire. But the story is a little more interesting than that and not as sensational. They certainly do come from the time of Solomon's temple and the general vicinity thereof. Greetings and welcome to Issues Etc., coming to you live from the studios of Lutheran Public Radio in Collinsville, Illinois. I'm Todd Wilkin. Thanks for tuning us in. We're going to talk about the discovery of wooden beams from the time of Solomon's Temple with Dr. David Adams, former director of the Concordia Center for Archaeology. Dr. Matt Phillips, professor of history, Concordia University, Nebraska, joins us for a conversation on medieval philosophers and theologians called the Scholastics. We'll get a bioethics update with Wesley Smith of the Discovery Institute Center on Human Exceptionalism, and a roundup of the 69th Regular Convention of the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod with Mark Stern, an attorney in Chicago and an LCMS convention voting delegate. Dr. David Adams is professor of Old Testament, Concordia Seminary-St. Louis, and he's a former director of the Concordia Center for Archaeology. Dr. Adams, welcome back.
Always good to be with you. Thank you, Todd.
What are some of the restrictions currently in place on archaeology and digging in ancient Jerusalem?
Well, there are actually quite a few challenges. Jerusalem is an extremely difficult place to do archaeology, and the restrictions, I think, would fall into three categories. First are what we might think of as the practical, in the sense that Jerusalem is a modern city. It's fully populated. People, are living everywhere. So to do any archaeological work, you'll be digging up under someone's house, someone's apartment building, some other buildings that are currently in use. So those buildings either have to be removed, or in some cases, this has happened a number of times where they actually do archaeological work in the basement of a building that is existing. So there are all sorts of practical difficulties that create practical restrictions, even if they're not legal. The second category of restrictions would be the legal ones that I just mentioned. Everything related to archaeology in Israel is under the authority of the Israeli Antiquities Association. So they have to give permission, and there are strict rules that have to be followed everywhere in Israel, but even more strict rules in Jerusalem because of the practical considerations that I mentioned a moment ago. The third set of restrictions are, in some ways, the most difficult, and they're the political. And this discovery that we're going to be talking about here is directly related to some of the political developments in Israel, particularly with regard to the seizure of Palestinian property, by Jewish groups and their appropriation of that property and the political fallout there, and frankly, the desire to use and seize control of as much of Jerusalem as possible. So there are practical problems, there are legal challenges, legal criteria that have to be met, and then there are frankly very complicated and problematic political issues to be sorted through.
Do we know where exactly these timbers that are linked to Solomon's temple were unearthed?
Yes, we do. This is part of the political matter that I was just talking about. To be clear, and I say that because some of the reporting that has come out this week has not been very clear on this point. These timbers are not actually part of Solomon's temple at all. They are from the period of the destruction of Solomon's temple, or at least that's what the archaeologists believe. So they are associated with Solomon's temple in the time of their destruction, but they're not a part of the temple complex in any way. And that can be clearly illustrated from the location that you just asked about. The archaeological excavation where these were found is known kind of in popular discussions as the Jivati parking lot, more formally the Wadi Hilwa Square. But the Jivati parking lot was intended to be a parking lot. That's why they started doing work there. They were going to make it into a parking lot. It's about 100 yards to the south and slightly to say on the southwest corner of the Temple Mount. So if our listeners could visualize maybe a map they've seen of Jerusalem in a Bible, or if they have their Bibles handy, kind of get it out if there are maps in there, and you can see the location of the Temple Mound from the time of Jesus, right? And if you go to like the southwest corner of the Temple Mound, there is a street that runs around there, and it's about, I don't remember exactly, maybe 100 yards south, about the length of a football field south of the Temple Mound, kind of due south of the southwest corner of the Temple Mound. So this is not part of the temple, and keep in mind that Solomon's temple was actually even farther away, assuming that the location of the Dome of the Rock is the correct location for Solomon's temple. It's another couple hundred yards further north even. So this was probably, these buildings from which these timbers were found were probably part of the royal administrative compound. They sit in the area that the Bible suggests David built his palace and his administrative center, and we assume then that Solomon built a separate palace for himself in a slightly different location, but we presume that this continued to be a significant administrative center. So the exact site is a bit to the south of the Temple Mound in this parking lot where there's an archaeological excavation going on. And the wooden beams that were found there are almost certainly part of some large building because of the size of the beams. Makes it clear we're dealing with a large building, not a domestic structure, not somebody's house. So a large building, possibly a palace, possibly some other royal administrative building. And I think if I remember correctly, this is thought to have been part of the roof of a courtyard in that building that was destroyed probably at the time of the destruction of Solomon's temple. That is to say, in 587/6 BC. By the way, today, as we record this, is the anniversary of the destruction of Solomon's temple. So it's entirely appropriate that we should be talking about it today. And frankly, that's one reason the news came out this week. But the location is just off the southwest corner, just directly south of the southwest corner of the Temple Mount.
One of the things I take it from the media coverage of this discovery that is significant is that the rings, the growth rings in these wooden beams have caught the attention of archaeologists. What do you know about that?
Well, there are a couple of ways that one might date wooden materials from the ancient past. One is carbon-14 dating. But carbon-14 dating is going to be problematic because the wood has been burned, and that changes the character of the wood. And I'm not a specialist in that area of carbon-14 dating. I can't, give you the exact details, but it would be much less reliable. So what they're hoping to do is what we refer to in archaeology as dendrochronological dating. That is to say, dating from tree rings. And over the last 50 years or so, a fairly substantial database has been built up examining tree rings from different parts of the world, but also here in Israel, which give us the growth pattern based on the climate. So rainier years, the trees would grow more and the rings would be wider. If we get several years of dry weather, then the rings are going to be more compact. And the pattern of the rings creates something like a fingerprint that can be matched with other tree ring patterns that are found. So even though the wood has been burned and it's probably not very suitable for carbon-14 dating, there's enough left that still preserves the pattern of the growth rings of the tree, that fingerprint of how the tree grew. And so what they're hoping, and I have to trust that they've done enough, these are reputable archaeologists, so I trust that they've done enough work that they feel confident in this, that they can recover the pattern of the tree rings and then compare that with what they already know and try to find a matching fingerprint, as it were. That is some point in history where the growth pattern of trees from this fairly close region would match the growth pattern of the wood that they have. And this would not tell you when the wood was destroyed. It would tell you when the tree grew. But that would still get you, fairly close, probably in the neighborhood. It would certainly tell you whether we're looking at the first temple or the second temple, for example. Those periods where Jerusalem was destroyed yet again in 70 AD. So you'd certainly be able to tell the difference between 70 AD and 586 BC or 587 BC. So there's a margin of error associated with all of these things. What they're hoping is that they could get to a margin of error of about 10 years, and that would, give a very reliable date that would associate the growth of the trees that were in the building, and then that would help us to be able to know when the building was destroyed at some later time. So complicated because there are a number of moving parts here that have to be taken into account, but the tree ring's not the only datable information that they have. They'll find they have found pottery, they found other artifacts, and they can date those as well using various means. And so in the end, the tree rings will become one piece of chronological information that can be then compared and joined with other pieces of information to give us a pretty reliable picture of when this building was destroyed. So that's what they're hoping to do with these tree rings.
At least according to the press reports, they feel pretty confident that this is buildings associated with the first temple, that of Solomon. How would you describe what that building and its surrounds were like when Solomon had it constructed?
Okay. First, again, if our listeners can visualize a map of Jerusalem, most Bibles that contain maps of Jerusalem are really maps of New Testament Jerusalem, unless they have multiples. But the Temple Mound was cleared off by King Herod in the Roman period when he rebuilt the temple starting in 20 BC, finishing about 6 AD, but they were still doing decorative work even at the time of Christ. So the exact location of Solomon's temple is a matter of debate, but most people are willing to accept that it was located on the same spot as the current Dome of the Rock, which would be more or less in the center, vertically from north to south, of the Temple Mount. So if you're looking at a map of Jerusalem or visualizing a map of Jerusalem and you have the Temple Mound, then Solomon's temple was most likely near the center of that area. Now, Solomon's temple was built on a natural hill, and that hill was flattened off and rebuilt, as I just said, by Herod. So much of the terrain, the topography, and the exact details of the way the Temple Mount would have looked in Solomon's time are lost to us. There are tunnels underneath. There are natural water passages underneath. There are underground passages that have been dug underneath. So there are things underneath the Temple Mound and surrounding areas. But there would have been a relatively small, compared to what we see on maps today, the temple enclosure would have been much smaller in Solomon's time than it was in Jesus' time. And to the south of that, then there was the administrative center where David's palace was and where the administrative buildings for the kingdom of Judah were located. Some of those are probably under part of the Temple Mount as it is today, and part of them were mostly to the south of the Temple Mount in the area that we today call the City of David, which is to the south of the Temple Mount.
Dr. David Adams is our guest. We're talking about the discovery of wooden beams from the time of Solomon's temple. How thorough was the temple's destruction? What do Jesus and Paul teach about marriage, divorce, unchastity, and desertion? The Issues Etc. book of the month for July is Divorce and Remarriage, Ecclesiastical Discernment and Pastoral Care. This new resource is published by Concordia Publishing House. Their phone number, 1-800-325-3040. You can learn more about divorce and remarriage at issuesetc.org. Divorce and Remarriage by Dr. Ben Mays. The Issues Etc. book of the month for July.
Lutherans for Life assists for-life Christians in offering the hope and help of the good news of Jesus Christ to women with an untimely pregnancy, women, men, and families suffering under the guilt of an abortion, young people with questions and concerns about sexuality, and the elderly and those with disabilities or terminal illnesses. Learn more about LFL resources and forming a life team or life chapter, or becoming a life advocate by calling 888-364-LIFE. That is 888-364-5433, or by visiting lutheransforlife.org.
The gold standard for Lutheran media. You're listening to Issues Etc.
At Risen Christ Lutheran Church in Arvada, Colorado, we have simply become captivated by the hilarious notion that God has sent His Son, Jesus Christ, into the world to save the losers of this world, losers just like us. We proclaim the biblical notion that God saves sinners. Embracing the historic liturgy of the Church, we confess that we are just that, sinners. Visit us online at risenchristlutheran.org.
I'm Dr. Russell Dawn, president of Concordia University Chicago, reminding you about the Prepared to Serve Church Professional Guarantee. Any new student in one of CUC's 6 church work programs will pay no more than $5,000 in annual tuition and required fees, guaranteed. Prepared to Serve is a donor-funded initiative. Support future Churchwork students by becoming a funding partner at cuchicago.edu/preparedtoserve. Concordia University Chicago. With Christ at the center, we stand tall for the church.
Welcome back. I'm Todd Wilkin. On this Thursday, July the 23rd, we're talking about the discovery of wooden beams from the time of Solomon's Temple. Dr. David Adams is our guest. Dr. Adams, how thorough was the temple's destruction? What was left?
Well, what was left was rubble, frankly. And you have to keep in mind that the destruction of Solomon's Temple in 587, 586 was not the only time that Jerusalem was invaded and sacked. Jerusalem was invaded and sacked in 605. It may have been sacked again. This is historically debatable, and the biblical record isn't quite clear on this, but it may have been sacked again in 601. And then it was sacked again in the 590s, and that was the time where Daniel and others were taken away into exile. And then it was sacked again in 587 and 586, and that time frame, 587, 586. So the city of Jerusalem in general was sacked several times in that decade leading up to the destruction of the temple. And there was already a lot of destruction there. The temple had been plundered by the leaders of Judah to get wealth to pay off the Babylonians, to bribe them, not to attack again and to pay tribute. So it was already impoverished in the sense that much of its wealth had been taken away. We don't know of any damage done to the temple in those earlier sackings of the city, but more people were actually carried into exile in those other times when the Babylonians came between 605 and 587. More people were carried into exile than were carried into exile in 587. So I forget the exact number. There were only a few hundred. I want to say 382, but I don't remember that number is exactly correct. But there were only a few hundred males carried into exile at the time the temple was destroyed. Most of the people who went into exile in the decade and a half before the destruction of the city. So much of the city would already have been, at least in parts, reduced to rubble. The temple destruction was the big thing that happened on the 9th of Av, which is today on the Jewish calendar, in 587/586, depending on how you sort out the dating there. What would have been left at the time, it would have been burnt. It would have been, the building itself was knocked down. Of course, the stones would still have been there, so there would have been rubble strewn across the hillside. There would have been probably, if one had looked closely, you might have found utensils that had been used in the temple service. You probably would have found bones from people who were killed. You would certainly have found remains of other buildings around the temple that had been destroyed as well. So the city would have been largely reduced to rubble, although people still lived there. Remember, it wasn't until again in 581 or 580, the Babylonians came back again, and that was when the people who, at least the leaders of the people who were still there, carried Jeremiah down with them when they fled to Egypt. So even 6 or 7 years after the destruction of the temple, there were still people living in Jerusalem. It was just a very small, much reduced city that had endured a lot of damage over the previous couple of decades by the time that happened at the end of Jeremiah's time. So the cumulative destruction that culminated with the destruction of the temple left the city in pretty much, let's just say dire straits.
Was there an attempt to rebuild when the people were returned from exile?
Oh, yes. The Bible actually gives us a fair amount of detail. They began to rebuild homes, obviously, and the city was never completely abandoned. Even during the exile, there were people who lived there. They were just small numbers. And so there were, they had been cleaning up during that whole period of the exile. New homes had been built. And when the exiles started to return, then they also built new homes, new buildings, and so forth. And most importantly, they began to rebuild the temple. And if you remember the account from biblical history, they had begun to rebuild the temple, and they also wanted to work on the walls around the city of Jerusalem to fortify it. And some of the other inhabitants in the area complained to the Persian authorities because Persia had conquered Babylon in the interim, and the Persians now ruled this area. So they complained to the Persian authorities, and the rebuilding was ordered to be stopped, at least the rebuilding of the walls. They also stopped rebuilding the temple for a number of years. And then Haggai and Zechariah and Ezra all contributed to encouraging the inhabitants to begin once again to rebuild the temple. And finally, the post-exilic temple, which we usually call Zerubbabel's temple because he was the leader of the returnees at that time. So Zerubbabel's temple was finished in 516, and there's a famous account in Haggai chapter 2 where people looked at the rebuilt temple and remembered the former glory of Solomon's temple and wept at the reduced glory, I guess we might say, of Zerubbabel's temple. And of course, Zerubbabel's temple was reduced in glory in another way, in that God did not come down in a theophany and inhabit that temple the way he had both the tabernacle and Solomon's temple. So it had a different theological status as well as having a different physical structure appearance.
Talk about Solomon's temple and its theological significance then.
Well, to talk about the theological significance of Solomon's temple, first we have to connect it to the tabernacle. God had promised the Israelites that he would be present with them and promised them that he would lead them to a land where he would dwell with them in the land. So God instructed them to build a tabernacle, a tent-like structure that was in the form of a temple, what we call archaeologically a megaron-style temple with a courtyard and an outer room and an inner room that we call the Holy of Holies. And so God came down, and the book of Exodus at chapter 40 gives us a picture of how God came down in a cloud, and the presence of God took up residence in the Holy of Holies of the tabernacle. So that remained throughout the period of wandering. When the Israelites got into the Holy Land, the temple was set up at Shiloh to the north of Jerusalem and remained there. It was destroyed, that is, the community, the town of Shiloh was destroyed during the period of the Judges. You may remember the Ark of the Covenant had been taken out and taken by the Philistines and eventually returned to the Israelites at Beth-Shemesh, and then later was taken to Kiryas Yearim, which is about 6 miles due west of Jerusalem, where it stayed then until David eventually brought it to the temple. And he set up some structure that is not described in the Bible. It may have been a rebuilt tabernacle, We don't know for sure, but he set that up on the hill that was just to the north of the city of David, what we today think of as the Temple Mount. So David set up some sort of rebuilt tabernacle there, put the Ark of the Covenant in it. And David had wanted to build a temple. God prohibited that, but allowed Solomon to do it. 2 Samuel 7, Solomon then rebuilds the temple and dedicates it in 1 Kings 8. And God again comes down in a cloud and takes up his residence in the temple. So the temple, theologically speaking, is not the same thing as a church that we think of today. People didn't go into the temple to worship. The only people who were allowed to go into the temple were the priests. So there were no pews there. There was an incense altar. There was the table of showbread, the bread of the presence. There were candelabras scattered around, but there was no place for people to gather in the temple building because the temple was the house of God in the literal sense. It was the place where God's presence took up his abode and lived there among the people. So then in Ezekiel 10, when God pronounces judgment upon them, the judgment that would finally lead to the destruction of Jerusalem, they passed the point of no return, if you will. God withdraws his presence from the temple and moves out across the Kidron Valley and up the hill the other side. The temple is destroyed by the Babylonians, and then when it's rebuilt, there is no theophany. God doesn't come down. He does not take up residence in the Holy of Holies again. There is no Ark of the Covenant in the Holy of Holies of the post-exilic temple, Zerubbabel's temple. Now, people still worshiped as if God were present there, and he was present there in a general sense in which God is present everywhere, but he wasn't present in the special sense that God was present in Solomon's temple or the tabernacle. And that remained the case down to the time of Christ, because in the incarnation, Jesus becomes the place where God is physically present on earth. He is the temple. And so you recall in the Gospels when he tells them that, they will tear this temple down, he will, it will rise up again on the third day, predicting his resurrection. So Christ is the temple. The temple that Herod built was never dwelled in by God in the way that Solomon's temple was or the tabernacle was. God was present there when Jesus went there, but otherwise God was present there only in a general sense. So the temple theologically is the physical place where God manifests his presence within the material world. He did that in the tabernacle, in the temple, and then subsequently in the person of Jesus Christ. And now, after Pentecost, God has taken up his dwelling in a different sense, to be sure, but still God has taken up his true dwelling place in you and I and in the whole church through baptism, where God takes up his presence in us. So the Pentecost miracle is applied, if you will, to each one of us through baptism. We become part of the temple. And so in the New Testament, St. Paul and others will speak of the church as the temple and of each individual Christian as the temple of God. So there's a very rich and theologically important understanding of the presence of God and how God reveals himself within the material world that connects, ultimately, Eden. We didn't talk about Eden, but connects the tabernacle with the temple, with the incarnation, with Pentecost, with the church, including you and I individually. And so it's a very important linkage, if you will, of biblical theology as God has revealed himself through the ages that connects the church today and God's presence in the church through Pentecost and baptism with the tabernacle in the Old Testament, including then along the way Solomon's temple as well.
This is Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're discussing the discovery of wooden beams from the time of Solomon's temple with Dr. David Adams. Ministry by Mail is a program of LCMS Ministry to the Armed Forces. Lutheran servicemen and women receive a welcome packet with devotional resources, including portals of prayer. Learn more at lcms.org/armed-forces, lcms.org/armed-forces. We'll talk about Ezekiel's vision of a giant temple next.
In making the case for the LCMS, I could channel Garrison Keillor and talk about Lake Wobegon and Pastor Inkvist's problems and the Picayunist troubles between the Missouri Synod and the other Lutherans. It would all be delightful. I could talk about potlucks and the smells wafting out of church basements on a Sunday morning.
Pastor Matt Harrison speaking at this year's Issues Etc. Making the Case conference.
But finally, that would all just fade away like so much pleasant aroma in the wind. Without Christ, without this public confession of Christ, it would all be for naught, all of it.
You can watch Pastor Matt Harrison's presentation, Making the Case for the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, from our 2026 Making the Case conference. For a contribution of $250 by Labor Day, we'll send you a link to conference video and audio recordings. Order online at issuesetc.org.
Truth-centered mission outreach. You're listening to Issues Etc.
The Lutheran Church Missouri Synod cares deeply for those who protect our nation. Are you or a loved one currently serving? Ministry to the Armed Forces would like to help. We provide devotional literature to encourage faith. Send your mailing address to lcmschaps@lcms.org or call us at 314-996-1337. Those in uniform are comforted with Psalm 28. The Lord is my strength and my shield. My heart trusts in him, and he helps me.
St. Paul appealed to the Corinthians that all of you agree and that there be no divisions among you, but that you be united in the same mind and in the same judgment. Unity and variety, united in mind and judgment, these all can be thorny topics among us, as they have been for Christians since the Church's earliest days. The June-July issue of the Lutheran Witness takes up these very topics. Pick up your copy at cph.org/witness or visit witness.lcms.org to learn more. The Lutheran Witness, helping you interpret the world from a Lutheran perspective.
Thanks to the following congregations for standing with us by becoming an Issues Etc. congregational sponsor: Beautiful Savior Lutheran Church, Spokane, Washington; Trinity Lutheran, San Angelo, Texas; Holy Cross Lutheran, Moline, Illinois; Prince of Peace Lutheran, San Diego, California; Shepherd of the Hills Lutheran, Snohomish, Washington; Augustana Lutheran, Moscow, Idaho; St. Paul Lutheran, Austin, Texas; Zion Lutheran, Marshall, Michigan; Our Savior Lutheran, Louisville, Kentucky; St. John Lutheran, Sycamore, Illinois; and Atonement Lutheran, Glendale, Arizona. Find out how your confessional Lutheran church can support this worldwide outreach by including Issues Etc. in your mission or advertising budget. Just go to issuesetc.org, click Support Donate, and print a one-page flyer. When your congregation becomes an Issues Etc. sponsor, we'll publicize your church on the podcast, at our website, and in the Issues Etc. journal. Welcome back to Issues Etc. I'm Todd Wilkin. We're talking with Dr. David Adams about the discovery of wooden beams from the time of Solomon's temple. I wanted you to speak to one other issue, and that is, you had mentioned the prophet Ezekiel. He has a vision of a temple in Jerusalem, but its proportions and its dimensions are far outstrip anything that has ever been built on the site. What is that about?
Yeah, in Ezekiel 40 to 48, we get a vision of the eschatological temple. And this is not any physical temple. It doesn't have the same shape. It doesn't have the same design as Solomon's temple, nor, by the way, does it have the same shape and design as what Herod built later. So Herod's temple is not the fulfillment of the vision that Ezekiel had. Ezekiel was envisioning an end-time temple. And that temple is, as we were just talking about, fulfilled in the church and ultimately, of course, in the eschatological kingdom of God, but primarily in the church today. So the boundaries of that temple, and we're given I don't remember the number of cubits now, but we are given the dimensions of that temple in the book of Ezekiel, and it wouldn't fit on the hill, the natural hill. It wouldn't even fit on the extension, the massive extension to that hill that Herod built. So it doesn't correspond to Herod's temple. And some people make that mistake of thinking that Herod's temple is in some way the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision. It's not. Ultimately, the fulfillment of Ezekiel's vision is Christ. It is, and then through Christ, through the church, and then the eschatological kingdom of God as well. So Ezekiel is envisioning the main point, if you will, is that in the age that Ezekiel is talking about, the age to come, not just after the exile, but the Messianic age, that God himself will once again appear and be present physically in the material world, not now in a building anything like Solomon's temple, but in a figurative building, a figurative temple that is the incarnation. So, Ezekiel's vision, I should have mentioned it, thank you for reminding me of that linkage between the presence of God in Solomon's temple and the tabernacle and the presence of God in the incarnation.
Finally, with a minute then, returning to this archaeological discovery, how would you rate the significance of this particular discovery of these beams associated with the time of Solomon's temple?
Well, on one hand, it's tremendously exciting because we have something, we don't have a lot of things from the first temple period. So recovering part of a building, and we're going to assume for the moment that they are able to establish a firm, chronological setting for that building, and that it does come, from the period of the destruction of the first temple. So we'll take that for granted at the moment. As I said at the outset, these are reputable archaeologists from the Israeli Antiquities Authority and from universities in Israel who are doing this work. It's not a fly-by-night group. They wouldn't be making claims for sensationalist purposes. And also, there have been other things found in this same parking lot that date to the first temple period. Most famously, of course, the famous Nathan Melech seal that was found in 2019, which appears to contain the name of a person actually mentioned in the Bible in 2 Kings 23:11, who was the servant of King Josiah. So that's found in this same parking lot, close by these same buildings. And the Bible actually tells us that the person by that name lived just close to the temple as well. So it's one of a growing body of evidence that fills in the picture for us, archaeologically speaking, of the events of the early 6th century when the temple was destroyed. So in that sense, it's really exciting. Is it that theologically important? No, because frankly, nobody doubted that there was a temple in Jerusalem. Nobody has really even doubted that the temple was destroyed by the Babylonians, 586 or 587. So in that sense, it doesn't prove anything that people seriously doubted. But it is part of a growing body of evidence. And every time we add to this body of evidence, we learn more about the real world of the Bible and the people who inhabited it. And the more we get that concrete picture of the real world of the Bible, the less people can treat the Bible as a fairy story. And in that sense, it's important.
Dr. David Adams is professor of Old Testament at Concordia Seminary-St. Louis and a former director of the Concordia Center for Archaeology. Dr. Adams, thank you very much.
Great to be with you, Todd, and hope to talk with you again soon.
On the other side, Dr. Matt Phillips of Concordia University, Nebraska joins us to talk about medieval philosophers and theologians called the Scholastics. What can we learn about the worship practices of the first Lutherans from a Reformation edict by a Calvinist leader? Find out in Will Whedon's column in the latest Issues Etc. journal. We'll send it to you for free. Just click the red journal subscription button at issuesetc.org and enter your email address. In the Wittenberg Trail feature, Pastor Michael Hughes writes about his journey from progressive Lutheranism to confessional Lutheranism. The Issues Etc. journal. Subscribe for free at issuesetc.org.
Does this sound like your church budget process at the end of the year? You get last year's budget and go through with a committee line by line, maybe what we should spend next year. Maybe you have a prayer. But where's the Word of God in this process? When do the people hear what the small catechism says about giving and why we do it? Contact us at LCMS Stewardship so that we can help you fix this process, put the Word of God first, and put your congregation on a good footing. lcms.org/stewardship.
Expert guests, expansive topics, extolling Christ. You're listening to Issues Etc.
This week on The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, we continue our walk through the Psalter, reflecting on Psalms 132 through 136. The Lord has chosen Zion. How good and pleasant it is. Our God is above all gods, the idols of the nations, and give thanks to the Lord. Join me, Pastor Will Whedon, for The Word of the Lord Endures Forever, your daily 15-minute verse-by-verse Bible study on demand. Listen at thewordendures.org or your favorite podcast provider.
Luther Academy provides additional theological education for our mission partners around the world, specifically pastors who are asking for additional education but do not have the necessary resources in their own church bodies. By donating to Luther Academy today, you will be supplying food, housing, books, professors, and travel for Lutheran pastors who attend our conferences. To learn more about Luther Academy and how you can donate today, visit lutheracademy.com. lutheracademy.com.